Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. I wanted to address a little bit of a controversial and thought-provoking subject today, which is that of how we actually define interpretation and define what is effective interpretation and communication within the museum and heritage sector. Because very often I find when we try to determine or define success or successful experiences or interpretation, we define it in terms of what can be measured. One of the first questions I always get whenever I have done a piece of interpretation in an exhibition, an activity, a live interpretation, whatever it is, the first question I'm always asked is, how many people came? How many people came to see this exhibition, or how many people attended this event, or whatever? Because a number is measurable. And it gives us a wonderful way of saying, okay, so did we do better than last time we did something similar? And that's how we measure success. Sometimes we might do a little bit of a visitor survey and we might ask visitors specific questions around, so what did you learn? What did you gain? Did you learn something you didn't knew about before? So we almost put words in their mouth by saying, what did you get out of this experience that can be measured for us? We want to measure how effective we are. And there is an increasing pressure, I find, to do that, sometimes from directors, from trustees, from boards and so on. Now, there's not actually anything wrong with this, but the problem is here that learning is very rarely the main reason for why visitors come. Very often visitors don't come with a specific goal or aim in mind, and it's depending on the social context in which you visit a museum. Sometimes you do. If you are there with a study group or with colleagues, there might be some sort of learning perspective in mind, in your mind when you visit. But if you come with your family, for example, you very rarely come to learn. You come to have a good experience. It's very, very difficult to determine what visitors should take with them. Now, it can be useful sometimes to use visitor definitions, for example, categorizing visitors to help us focus an exhibition theme or a subject or a live interpretation experience. That can be helpful sometimes when setting out an experience, but we cannot actually determine, we cannot guarantee that the learning outcomes I have defined and I have written down is also what visitors are going to take with them. That is impossible. We all come with different packages, different experiences, hobbies, interests, knowledge, prior knowledge, and so on. It's impossible to define exactly and to guarantee that what I want visitors to take with them and what I want them to learn is also what they take with them and what they learn from this. I would also argue, and I know this is a little bit thought-provoking, but I would also argue sometimes that when we set out and define things like goals, aims, learning outcomes, instead of effective communication and interpretation, that is sometimes when we lose sense of purpose and of creativity, simply because we have this huge desire to want to measure success. I have very often been asked by directors, managers, collection managers to create a procedure for example, an exhibition. Wouldn't it be lovely, Jane, if we had a procedure for this live experience or whatever it is? I have always pushed back and said no, because the moment you create a procedure for brainstorms and for idea generation is the moment you kill creativity. You cannot create a procedure for or a manual or indeed a set of instructions for creativity, because that is going against the definition of creativity. Creativity is an unusual experience. It's about gaining new ideas, and if you have a procedure for how you do something, you do things the usual way. You're not doing things in the unusual way anymore. You already have a template, a set of procedures that you can follow to make sure you do things the exact same way you did the last time. That is killing creativity. So let's just try and have a look at what exactly is meant by effective interpretation and what is meant by defined interpretation. Now, defined interpretation are all these procedures and briefs and goal definition, visitor definitions, learning outcomes, and so on, that museums very often have templates for or briefs for, and that you have to write before you even start brainstorming any ideas for a new interpretation activity. Now, these are often based around numbers and things that are measurable, and they are very often short-lived because they create experiences that are here and now, and you might have learned a little bit, and then that's kind of it. The effective interpretation is everything that is creative and also provokes sometimes. They have to be thought-provoking. They have to motivate, to inspire, to be built around empathy. They have to play with your imagination and your own creativity. They are also set out the experiences and not so much the goals and the definitions and the outcomes. They also observe visitors in the environment, so we actually learn from visitors here. Not through surveys or pre-defined questions, but learn from what visitors, from visitor behavior and from what visitors are actually doing in the exhibitions. That makes them more long-term. They are experiences that stay with visitors, but they are also more difficult to measure. Now, just to have a look at where we can seek inspiration from, because I often find that it's difficult to figure out yourself, where can I try to find more effective and creative interpretation experiences? Where can I find inspiration and ideas for doing this? And there are some disciplines that we sometimes look at a little bit in interpretation, but we rarely embrace their approaches. And I've tried to come up with a little list. There are many more, of course, but some of these can be, for example, theatre directors or indeed movie directors. They also set up and direct a storyline. They rarely do so with learning outcomes in mind. They have a story they want to tell, and they obviously they think the story is important and it is relevant, else they wouldn't have embarked upon the story, but they focus on the story more than anything. I've also found looking at conductors, orchestra conductors, can be really, really interesting, because a conductor is the only person in an orchestra that you never hear. You never hear them, but the music cannot be played without them. They serve as a direct messenger for the composer, and the musicians rely entirely upon the conductor to start the storyline. So their approach is really, really interesting as well. Architects, people who build, who design, who create, the same goes for artists and designers. Also the use of physical material here, and the opportunity of enhancing certain messages in a storyline, for example, can be really, really inspirational to look at. Writers, everything from authors, script writers, they also play with imagination. They communicate, they combine characters and events and stories, and there are many, many more, of course. But looking at the approaches of some of these different jobs and disciplines can be really, really rewarding as well, and also really really sort of provoking in looking at our own way of measuring interpretation too. So where do we start when it comes to creating effective interpretation? How can we create almost like a vision for it? If we want our interpretation to be effective, to stay with visitors long term, and to focus on the creativity, where can we start then? How can we write this down, and how can we start identifying it? I've tried to come up with a few points that I hope might be helpful in this discussion. First of all, identify and focus on your story. Now, I want to tell you a story about this king, or this time period, or this war, or this battle, or this event, or whatever it is. Simply define what is the story that you want to tell. It's very, very simple. Now, write down reasons for why this story is important. Why did the story matter? Why does it still matter? Why is it relevant? Don't define how visitors should experience or learn the story, because they will find out themselves along the way if the story is interesting enough. But focus on, why should this story be told? Why is it interesting at all? Now, also try and look at what are the experiences that the story can highlight and bring forward in terms of course, what happened maybe historically, but also is there links to something that happens today that makes the story relevant. And this also goes a little bit hand in hand with the next point, which is try and write down what you imagine will happen. Now, these objects, for example, or this experience, whatever, will convey a certain mood, it will convey certain experiences and knowledge, like this live event will, or like this live interpretation, or whatever it is you're trying to do will. What do you imagine will happen when you combine these stories or these characters or these objects? And identify how you want to take visitors into a story. Is this a story that's told perhaps mainly via objects, via collections, or is it told via actors, movies, sound, games, activities, interactives, whatever it might be? How do you want to take visitors into this story? So this is kind of your content, your material, if you like. Now, a very important one, create spaces for imagination and for stories to grow and be shared. Now, often these can be physical spaces as well. They can be literally in a cafe after an exhibition experience, for example, or after a piece of live interpretation, or perhaps an interpretation event. Where can imagination grow? Where can it be shared? Not just between visitors that I already know because I might visit the museum with them, but also between visitors that might not know each other. Where is the physical space for imagination to be shared, for experiences to be shared, for knowledge to be shared here? It's not necessarily within the actual exhibition space or museum space. It can be in the cafe or outside or somewhere else. But make sure that there is space for it, either physical space or indeed mental space. Use empathy. Now, some visitors come to learn, some visitors come to have fun, some come reluctantly because they've been pulled along, some come, many I would argue, come with no purpose or no goal in mind at all. Use your empathy here. What would you have focused on if you had come to see this? What would you be interested in yourself? Not what would your trustees or what would your directors or what would your learning outcomes say about this, or your visitors' definition say about this, but where do you see the fun? What is interesting here? What is fascinating about this story? Why was it that I want this story to be told? Another really useful thing is create partnerships beyond the usual. Now, we tend to very often go back to using the same design agencies or companies that we already know because we have a good work collaboration with them, or we use the same people or group of actors or whoever it is that we know we work well with. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But try also to think a little bit outside the box here. If we are to create some unusual creative experiences, both within an exhibition, within a piece of live interpretation, within activities, within interpretation events, we have to start focusing on not just different partnerships, but also different approaches. And this can be time consuming, and it can cost a lot of time and money and effort and working hours, but it can be unbelievably rewarding because it forces you to look at your own material, your own collection, your own buildings, your own objects, your own stories and so on in a completely different way. And that is creativity beyond anything. Now, the reason why I wanted to try and address this issue is that I often find that we define an experience so much in terms of what can be measured, and that's how we define success as well, that we tend to forget that interpretation and also that of museum and heritage and historic interpretation and storytelling is an incredibly creative field, and it's something that we all create together, not just museums or museum professionals or heritage professionals on their own, but it's shared experience that we want to convey. And therefore we also share our knowledge and our imagination in this journey when we do this. And And yes, that is incredibly difficult to measure. So maybe it's actually time that we start to try and look at this in different ways, and also look at other jobs and disciplines where they don't necessarily look at how things are measured, but look at how creativity is best conveyed and how we can best create relevant and fun and imaginative and creative experiences together. I would like for future interpretation to also develop a little bit in that direction, and I think it can only do that if we open up for different ways of defining and creating effective interpretation, and the fact that we're willing to try and discuss these things and how we actually approach things and do things. So it would be really, really interesting to hear how you go about this and what you think about these things. And also, as usual, remember to like the videos and subscribe to the channel and add your comments.